19, but I want to take a bath, or some problems with difficult species. During my childhood, the coconut became a symbol of the tropical isles and all the wonders of Oceania. In the well-thumbed books secreted in the crow's nest of my climbing tree, a selection from Robert Louis Stevenson, Nordorf Hall, and my favorite Frisbee, coconut palms usually grew along low-lying coastal areas. There was a reason for this. Either I was told or I read in some source long since forgotten. The coconut, its seed too heavy for birds to carry, bobbled its way endlessly through the tropics on the ocean's currents. So coconuts became, for me, romantic messengers, nature's drifting bottles carrying not SOS, but promises of excitement and adventure. Wherever we traveled by sea, and even later working on a deep sea trawler, I acquired the dubious reputation of being a coconut nut by insisting whenever an unidentifiable object floated by in a wake that it was a stray coconut. With such daydreams and little chance of going to the South Seas in the near future, it was obvious that sooner or later I would have to grow a coconut palm myself. To guarantee at least one sprouting palm, I brought home 7 of the biggest brown coconuts to be found at the local fruit stand. I filled the bathtub with water and added 20 heaping tablespoons of salt. The same nebulous information source that had helped explain the coconut's cosmopolitan distribution via the ocean waves had stressed that it wouldn't germinate unless permeated with salt water. It has to float around in the ocean at least 2 months before being washed ashore or it won't sprout. I dragged the chair into the bathroom by the tub and climbed up with my bag of coconuts. One by one, I dropped the nuts from as high as I could reach to simulate falling from a tree. After watching them bob in the tub for a few minutes, I withdrew to the living room to reread nostalgically Hall's The Forgotten One and other true tales of the South Pacific, while my coconuts drifted contentedly in circles. By the time Susan came home, I was thoroughly engrossed in the book and no longer within the confines of a New York apartment. She draped around several yards of material she'd bought for a coat, and I made appropriate, if somewhat distant, noises of approval. Studying my dream-like stupor for a moment, she gave up, mumbling something about feeling tired and grimy from pounding the pavement and taking a shower. 5 minutes later, I looked up and observed her confronting me, arms akimbo, across my ottoman. I smiled innocently. "The bathtub seems to be full of coconuts," she said. "Uh-huh. They going to be there long?" "About 2 months." I closed the book on my finger. "Why?" "Oh, nothing. I just thought I might want to take a bath before next year." I explained how all she had to do was take the coconuts out for the duration of her bath, fill up the tub again with cool water, add 20 tablespoons of salt, making sure to mix well, and 7 coconuts. I pointed out she could keep them in the sink while she used the tub. Susan nodded understandingly, but I thought I detected a definite gleam of mutiny in her eyes. I returned to the South Pacific, the gargling of the bathtub suggestive of an approaching typhoon. Some weeks later, the brown, fibrous coconuts had acquired a decidedly slippery feel, but nothing else. I shook them. The milk was still sloshing around inside. Probably it was quite a bit cooler in a bathtub than where coconuts normally soak, I reasoned, so it could well take another couple of months. Susan didn't think so. 2 months to the day of my coconut launching, she marched into the living room after dinner with a carton full of soggy coconuts. She put it on my lap. "Bathtubs," she announced, "are for people." Well, maybe I had been using the wrong approach. I decided to look a bit deeper into the problems of coconut cultivation. Most of my fondest dreams were devastated by research. Not only did the coconuts not have to be permeated by salt water in order to sprout, this idea might have come from the fact that palms will subsist in soil permeated with brackish water containing a high concentration of salt. But according to Tropical and Subtropical Agriculture by Otje, Sol, Dijkman, and Weilberg, there is even some question as to whether the coconut can maintain itself in the wild state, or is merely a crop plant, pure and simple. So much for the romantic cradling of the ocean's currents. Furthermore, a coconut that has been broken free of its thick outer husk never can germinate. The husk is an integral part of the seed and is sole source of nourishment, particularly potash or several months of following germination. In commercial plantations, large, well-matured nuts are planted lying horizontal, about 2/3 covered in loose, rich soil. They have to be exposed to some light. Totally buried, the seed, like that of an avocado, will not germinate. The first sprout makes its appearance roughly 2 months after a seed is planted. The nourishment in the nut itself helps sustain the plant through its first year of growth. For most of this time, the leaves remain whole, only later splitting into the familiar palm fronds. The palm remains trunkless, contenting itself with sending out more and more leaves for several years until a crown is built up the diameter of a mature trunk. With each successive layer of green built onto the crown, more roots are spread out from the thickening base until by the time the crown finally begins to rise, there may be as many as 4,000 separate roots. A mature tree may have as many as 7,000, all of which help to keep the palm from blowing over in the loose sandy loam it prefers. Very nice, but where in the city was I going to find a large, well-matured coconut complete with husk? The problem solved itself in an unexpected way. My mother had been sick that summer and by vacation time was still not able to travel far. So my father took her to Florida to laze on the beach. I've never been all that interested in the Miami area. I perused their postcards showing a series of high-rise hotels and kidney-shaped swimming pools 3 feet from the ocean's edge, only far enough to determine that all was well. My father has a habit of summing up a situation with put-on folk sayings, so his cryptic note, Confucius say of Florida, nuts to you, registered in my mind only as his mind protest against having had to cancel their original plans to explore the Yucatan Peninsula. I was thus totally unprepared for the shock of finding he had spent the entire return flight with a large, well-matured and slightly sprouting coconut lolling nonchalantly on his lap. As I discovered in the weeks following my parents' fruitful trip, the coconut is an ideal plant for the apartment dwellers. It's been far too long ignored. The only drawback is its need for a very sunny, warm spot. For commercial growth, I understand coconuts require a mean temperature of at least 80 degrees. But I've found that as long as there's plenty of sun, they will grow, if not at the lushest, with an average temperature of 72 to 74 degrees. Most apartments have a spot somewhere that can be kept this warm. In winter, however, the coconut will have to be watched closely. By a window, it will be much colder even as far as a foot from the pane than you would expect. If you get hold of a large coconut in its husk, and I've noticed some places sell them now as novelties, there is about a 1 in 4 chance you can get it to germinate. Next to selecting the biggest and ripest one you can find, the most important step is to make sure that wherever it sits, it's propped up so the fat end is about 2 inches higher than the pointed end. I don't know where they developed their finicky attitude towards posture, but coconuts are apt not to germinate unless resting at an angle of about 10 degrees, depression end up. Maybe it stems from the fact that depression is the first part of the husk to decay, letting in more water. The properly propped coconut set in a pan should be sprayed lightly with water every day, particularly around the hollow. The two main watering places for the coconut are the crack through which the sprout pushes its way, and before that happens, this depression at the fat end by which the nut once hung, acorn-like from the palm. The depression will respond to watering almost like a sponge. Give it all at once every other day. To give the incipient roots the feeling they have somewhere to go, it's a good idea to fill the pan in which the coconut rests with an inch or so of moist sand. This homemade beach also makes it easier to keep the nut at the proper angle. By the time second leaf has sprouted, the coconut is definitely ready for some real soil. Roots may already be breaking through the husk before this, in which case plant it right away, even if it has as little as one undeveloped leaf showing. Delayed planting tends to aid and abet stunting, a tendency that indoors already manifests itself too readily because of less than ideal conditions. The nuts should be only partially buried, about 2/3, slanted at the same angle as before. Pretzel can or redwood tubs are about the only spots big enough for coconuts. But whatever container you use, make sure it has sufficient drainage. The reason the coconut palm thrives so happily along low-lying coast, however salty, is that the tides constantly raises and lower the water table of the porous soil, aerating it. Like many tropical plants, the coconut does not develop those almost microscopic hair roots you see on plants native to the temperate zones, and even with its massive system of larger roots, it has trouble absorbing enough oxygen without this changing groundwater level. To ensure a soil that is both loose, permitting good aeration, and rich enough to sustain the palm, I use a mixture 1/4 vermiculite or rough sand, 1/4 potting soil, and 1/2 humus. It is important to plow up the soil with a fork to a depth of 3 to 4 inches each week or so to prevent caking. Never spray a coconut's leaves when watering. Although in its natural habitat, the palm's leaves are often soaked in ocean spray, this is accompanied by winds which evaporate the water away quickly. The robust leaves are not affected by the salt, so no damage is done. But a prolonged period of dampness, as would follow indoor spraying, tends to foster fungi, themselves invisible but causing the leaves to develop yellow splotches, eventually turning brown, giving them a burnt look. Twice a month, the palm should be watered so heavily that a pool collects in the tray beneath the pot. But be sure to empty the tray afterwards. Better yet, since the waterlogged pot will be heavy, rest it on a layer of stones or a double layer of marbles, which will act like a set of worn-out ball bearings when you turn the pot. Then dripping out will not stay in contact with the bottom of the pot, which would promptly reabsorb it again. Watering plants occasionally by osmosis from the bottom up is a good idea in general if done with temperance. But if the soil becomes too saturated by heavy watering from either above or below, and the pot is left sitting in a puddle in its drainage dish, the standing water will rot the roots and sour the soil, killing the plant. This is especially true for coconuts and other tropical plants. Since I water my coconut so heavily twice a month, I find it necessary to fertilize it more often than other plants. Nutritive substances in the soil are water soluble, which is how they are absorbed by the plant. This also means that when water drains right through a pot, it takes along some of the nourishment with it. This leaching out of the soil can only be offset by good fertilization. By the time a palm is a year old, it will have a number of large leaves, some finally beginning to split into the frond-like structure of the mature leaf. It is ready for a higher ground level, achieved by adding enough soil to cover the exposed third of the nut, which by now should be decaying away. The new layer of soil does the most good if it is made especially rich. A trip to the local mounted police for some horse manure would really be ideal at this point. It's the perfect accessory crowd into the soil before the additional layer is applied. Susan, however, put her foot down on manure in our small living room in winter and talked me into using an extra richly fertilized mixture of potting soil and humus instead. It's done just as well, actually. There's not a chance in the world of getting your coconut palm to flower indoors, much less bear fruit. You'll never become a self-made copra baron that way. This most valuable derivation of the coconut, copra, the dried meat of the ripe nut, was the main cargo hauled by the much romanticized inter-island schooners that used to ply the Pacific under full sail. Although it takes an awful lot of coconut, well over 5,000, to make a ton of copra, it is so rich in vegetable oil that the lucrative copra trade flourished in spite of the size limitations on sailing ships and all the hardships and dangers involved. Schooners have long since lost their place in the economic limelight. Copra has not. It is used in the compounding of medicines, the manufacture of soap, margarine, and a number of other commodities requiring high-grade oil. The pressed cake remaining after the oil has been extracted from copra is high in protein, sugar, and vitamins, and makes excellent cattle fodder. The coconut husks are saved as well, either for mulch or more recently for making into a light-colored fiber. On an individual human basis, however, perhaps the most significant value of the coconut is still as a staple eaten out of hand. In the late 1950s, it was estimated that some 400 million inhabitants of the tropics depend on the coconut as their sole or major source of fat. The same study estimated the annual world production of coconuts at nearly 2 billion. Both figures startled me right out of my daydreams of coconut schooners drifting lazily in clear blue lagoons, waiting to take on a cargo of a couple of thousand nuts. There are still countless weary vagabonds in the tropics to whom a coconut grove comes into view as the oasis does to a desert traveler. Thankfully, they will pause in their travels to gather a coconut, lob off the top with a swift slice of the machete, and drink the cool, thirst-quenching and nourishing coconut milk. Along unnumbered equatorial beaches, nutramint has nothing on the coconut. So maybe it's economic justice that the coconut should bear in tropic corners and not in mine. In any case, I've decided my palm suits my window just fine the way it is and has the added advantage of not dropping one of 2 billion coconuts unexpectedly on one of New York's 8 million heads. With those kinds of numbers involved, chances would be pretty high.